Welcome to Thriller Recaps. Today, I am explaining the movie, Nocturnal Animal, explaining every scene as it happens. Watch till the end, and please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy this. The movie began in a gallery where art from people with weight issues was being displayed. Susan, who was there, found it hard to breathe. She went home and returned to work the next day. Her assistant told her that she had received a package that morning. While trying to open it, she cut her finger and asked her assistant to help her. Inside the package was a note from her ex-husband, Edward. He had written a novel and sent it to her because it reminded him of the time they spent together. He wanted her to be the first to read it. The novel was titled Nocturnal Animal. At home, Susan's husband, Hutton, noticed the novel and asked her about it. She told him it was from Edward, and Hutton didn't quite remember who Edward was. Susan explained that Edward was her ex-husband and that they had broken up when she and Hutton got together. Hutton then asked if she had spoken to Edward in the past 20 years. Actually, it had been 19 years, and the last time Susan called him, he hung up on her. It hurt her that Edward never remarried. Susan asked Hutton why he hadn't come to the gallery. He said he had been busy. Their marriage wasn't going smoothly. Hutton was often in and out of the house because he was trying to close a deal, and was running out of money. Susan promised to help him by filling the gap with an LA artist, so he wouldn't appear broke. The scene shifted to a party where Hutton was mingling with others while Susan talked to her sister-in-law and a friend. Her friend seemed to notice everything, even though they were trying to hide it. Susan's brother was gay, but her friend knew she was the only woman in his life and that they were best friends who might even love each other. Love, after all, covers lust. Unfortunately, Susan and Hutton didn't share that connection. Susan's friend asked if she still loved Hutton, but Susan avoided answering the question. Hutton had to leave the party early to catch his flight to New York for a deal. Susan gave him a quick peck on the cheek and wished him luck, though she thought he needed it more than she did. After Hutton left, Susan went back to the party, where her brother, Colton, complimented her on how incredible she was at the gallery. However, Susan didn't think so. She didn't care about the arts and felt disconnected from this part of her life. Colton argued that their world was better than others. Later that night, Susan opened the novel Edward had sent her. It was dedicated to her. The story was about a family of 3 on a road trip. Their teenage daughter didn't want them to stop anywhere, so they kept driving, even through the night. Along the way, they encountered a rough driving car, and a minor accident occurred. The occupants of the car cornered them after some time. The family was frightened and stayed inside their car. The father only rolled down his window to talk to them. The other driver accused them of driving off after the accident, but the mother argued that the rough driving had caused the mishap, not their fault. The father, wanting to avoid trouble, suggested they exchange information. However, there was no signal, so they couldn't call the police. The goons started to mockingly exchange information and burst into fits of laughter at their own jokes. They told the father that his tire had burst, but the family didn't believe them. The goons told him to try driving away if he could, but the tire was indeed ruined. They then offered to fix it for him, and after that, they could go to the police station. The father agreed, having no other choice, and stepped out of the car to show them his spare tires. They would use their tools to fix it. The father opened the trunk, and they had to unload all their belongings to access the tire. Next, the goons asked him to tell his family to come out of the car, as they couldn't change the tire with them inside. Once they were done, the goons weren't ready to let the car go. They proposed taking the car with them while the family rode in their vehicle. The only other option was for the teenage daughter to come with them. The father saw a police van driving past and screamed for help, but it didn't stop. There was a struggle as the family tried to fend off the goons, but eventually, the goons drove away with the teenage daughter and the wife in the father's car. Susan stopped reading and wiped her teary eyes. Tony, the father, was forced to ride alongside one of the goons who stayed behind. He was sure the road passed his car, but the goons insisted it wasn't his. They drove until they reached the end of the road, then pushed Tony out as they drove away with his car, threatening him. Tony wasn't taken to his family as promised. He walked a few miles, and when he heard what he thought was his car approaching, he quickly hid between the rocks. The goons called out to him, saying his wife and daughter wanted him, but he didn't come out, and they eventually left. Tony didn't leave his hiding spot until the next morning, when the sky had its usual early morning orange hue. When he saw a van approaching on the main road, he screamed for help, but the driver didn't stop. He continued walking until he reached a farmhouse and asked the lady there if he could use her phone. Tony reported the incident to the sheriff. There was no news about his wife and daughter, and the location the goons had mentioned seemed to be made up. Tony still had his credit card, so he stayed at a motel. He spent most of his time crying or lost in thought. The next day, He received a call from the sheriff saying that his car had been found, but there were no traces of his family. The case had been transferred to a different lieutenant, who wanted to pick him up from the motel. Tony met with the lieutenant, who asked him several questions. The lieutenant suggested Tony return to the place where he had been dropped off to retrace his steps and see if his family might be there. Tony agreed. They drove to the location, and Tony recognized every path he had taken. The lieutenant knew of a popular place that headed in the same direction. They went there and found Tony's wife and daughter hugging each other on a soda outside. Their eyes looked soulless and wide open. The lieutenant assessed them, while Tony crouched on the ground, unsure of what to do. He questioned if they were all right. Susan shut the book and picked up her phone to call her daughter. It was early in the morning, and her daughter was still in bed with a man lying beside her. They were both. When her daughter answered the call, she asked why her mother had called so early on a Saturday morning. Susan told her that she missed her and wanted to hear her voice. The call ended with an "I love you" from both parties. Susan remembered how she had met Edward again in New York. They were both from Texas, but Susan was pursuing her master's at Columbia while Edward was looking for a scholarship there. Susan suggested they have dinner together. During the dinner, Edward revealed that he had spent so much time with Susan's brother, Colton, to be close to her. Susan interrupted, saying that Edward was also Colton's crush. Edward didn't know Colton was gay, and he felt bad for not contacting Edward for years. The conversation then shifted to Susan's parents, who were not supportive of Colton and had practically disowned Susan because of their overly religious beliefs. At the end of the dinner, Susan confessed that Edward was also her first crush and suggested they go home together. The scene then shifted back to the novel, where the lieutenant was telling Tony about a similar hijacking that had occurred the previous night on the same highway. The lieutenant suggested taking Tony's fingerprints from the trunk, as there were many of them, to help identify which ones belonged to whom. He also informed Tony about the tragic fate of his family. His wife had a fractured skull, and his daughter had been suffocated. Both had been. Tony had previously mentioned a trailer, and it turned out to be true. The goons had indeed been there. Fortunately, the trailer owner hadn't been around for a while, and the goons had only broken in. The good news was that they could easily collect fingerprints from there. Susan then remembered a past conversation she had with her mother about moving and marrying Edward. Susan didn't actually like her mother, and if there was one thing she loathed, it was being told she was similar to her. Her mother believed Edward wasn't her equal, criticizing him for lacking money, ambition, and being fragile. Her mother thought that Susan would eventually want the bourgeoisie things she didn't find amusing. Susan didn't even think her mother made any sense. Susan then wrote a letter to Edward, expressing that his book was both devastating and great, and suggesting they meet up. The scene shifted to Tony, who was having a hard time sleeping and was plagued by dreams of his family's struggle. The police were still investigating the case. One of the goons had been caught, one was dead, and the last one had escaped. Tony had shaved off his beard and looked notably different. He was asked to identify the captured goon. Tony instantly recognized the goon. They asked the goon, named Lou, if he recognized Tony, but Lou didn't seem to. However, when Tony told the story, a realization set in on Lou's face, though he still denied knowing anything about it or his other accomplices. Lou was taken back to his cell. The lieutenant then asked Tony if he was ready to testify in court, and Tony confirmed that he was. The lieutenant also had evidence against Lou from the fingerprints. The scene shifted back to Susan at work. She looked overly distracted, and one of her staff noticed that she hadn't been sleeping. Susan admitted that she never sleeps and that her ex-husband used to call her a nocturnal animal. Her staff didn't know about Susan's ex-husband, so the conversation led to Susan discussing how she had treated Edward badly and left him in a brutal way because she didn't believe in him. She expressed how sad it was that she had been thinking about him too much. Susan was talking to a coworker about a monitoring device that the coworker used to keep an eye on her baby via her phone. Susan took the phone to look at it, but when she saw an image of a woman acting demonic, she dropped the phone, which ended up being broken. She apologized quickly, saying it seemed she had imagined the woman she saw on the screen. Back in the novel, Tony and the lieutenant arrived at the home of Ray, one of the goons who had escaped. Ray was a plumber with no criminal history, and there were no fingerprints linking him to the crime. He had a girlfriend but used the same trailer where Tony's family had been found to hide his own hidden affairs. Ray was on the toilet seat outside, taking a dump, when they approached him and asked him to follow them for questioning. In the car, Tony rode up front, while the lieutenant sat in the back with Ray. Ray protested, claiming they were infringing on his rights, but the lieutenant assured him that he could get him a lawyer and take him to the station. Reluctantly, Ray agreed to answer the questions. The lieutenant asked Ray if he recognized the car they were in or remembered Tony, but Ray denied ever knowing anything. Tony reiterated the story of everything that had happened, but Ray continued to act like he didn't remember. They took him to the trailer where the murder had occurred, but Ray still didn't seem to recall anything. Tony became emotional and hit Ray in the face. The book fell from Susan's hands as she recalled a memory of her and Edward. She had told Edward that he should write less about himself, but Edward became defensive. He thought Susan didn't believe in him, and all he wanted as a creative was for the love of his life to enjoy his work. Back in the novel, Tony was informed by the lieutenant that Ray was going to be acquitted because there was no substantial evidence. Tony didn't want that to happen and asked if anything could be done. They met up later, and the lieutenant revealed, in a calm manner, that he had lung cancer. Tony was shocked, especially since the lieutenant was always smoking, but he learned that's just how it was. The lieutenant didn't want to let murderers like Ray go, and since he had nothing to lose, he was determined to make sure of it, even if it meant breaking the law. Susan remembered a moment when she told Edward that she couldn't continue the relationship, not because she was scared, but because she was unhappy. Edward seemed unable to accept this, but Susan simply walked away. In the novel, Tony and the lieutenant went to a bar where Ray was and arrested him. Instead of taking him to the station, they took him to Lieutenant Andres' house. Ray smirked, claiming that Andres didn't have substantial evidence, and that this was illegal. Andres replied that the only reason Ray was there was because it was more comfortable, and that Lou had already implicated Ray. Lou was also brought in, cuffed, and confronted by Ray in a whisper about why he had mentioned his involvement in the murder. Lou received the same explanation and realized they had both been deceived. Tony had a gun pointed at them, while Andres removed the cuffs and held their hands behind their backs. Andres taunted Tony to do something to Ray and Lou to exact his revenge, but Tony was visibly jittery. Andres started coughing loudly, giving Lou and Ray the distraction they needed to run away. Andres quickly collected the gun and managed to shoot Lou, killing him. Ray, however, escaped. Susan sighed loudly, recalling a memory of her and Hutton in the car. She was crying after aborting Edward's baby, feeling she could never look Edward in the eyes again, while Hutton consoled her. When she looked up, she saw Edward, drenched in the rain, watching them with sad eyes. The scene shifted back to the novel, where Tony was crying and telling himself he could have stopped what happened, but it was too late. Andres gave Tony the gun and told him to split up to find Ray before he could hitchhike. Tony found Ray sleeping in the trailer and aimed the gun at him. Ray spoke, saying the murder had been an accident. Ray also taunted Tony, saying he couldn't handle a gun because he was weak. Ray picked up a rod from under his pillow, which Tony hadn't seen, and approached him. Ray talked about how he remembered being with Tony's wife, which aggravated Tony. In a fit of rage, Tony shot Ray in the shoulder. Ray retaliated, hitting Tony multiple times with the rod until he passed out. Tony woke up with badly bruised eyes and could barely see. Ray was dead, a bullet lodged in his chest. Tony found his way out and shot the gun into the air, but then he collapsed on the floor, his eyes growing dim. Susan received a reply from Edward, agreeing to meet. She remembered how she used to curl up in his arms. She dressed beautifully and went to the diner, waiting and waiting, but Edward never showed up, not even at the very end.